In 1823, the American wilderness was not a place you explored for adventure. It was a place you survived, or didn't. There were no roads cutting through the land. No rescue teams waiting on standby. Signals to send if something went wrong. Just endless forest, wide rivers that carved through rock, and silence so deep it felt like it was watching you. Somewhere inside that silence, a man was about to be erased from the world. His name was. He was a trapper and frontiersman, hardened by cold winters and long hunts. He had joined a fur expedition pushing deep into the northern plains of what would later become the Dakota Territory. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. Supplies were limited. Danger was normal. But even for men like them, what was about to happen was beyond anything they had faced before, and it would turn one man's suffering into one of the most unbelievable survival stories ever recorded. Glass had moved slightly ahead of the group that morning, scouting near a quiet riverbank. The air was still, the land felt empty. Then he saw her, a grizzly bear with her cubs. There was no warning growl that gave him time to escape. No second chance. The attack came fast, overwhelming, brutal. When the other trappers heard the chaos and rushed toward the sound, they found a scene that silenced even the toughest among them. Glass was barely breathing. His body was torn and broken. He could not stand. He could hardly speak. They carried him away from the river, unsure if he would last another hour. They waited beside him, expecting death to come quietly. But it didn't. He kept breathing, slow, weak, but alive, and that made their situation far worse. The expedition could not stop for long. They were deep in dangerous territory, and there were constant fears of attack from rival tribes. Food was limited. Moving a severely wounded man across hundreds of miles of wilderness would slow them down. And possibly doom everyone. A decision was made. 2 men were ordered to stay behind with Glass until he passed and then give him a proper burial. One of those men was. They dug what looked like a grave. They waited. A day passed, then another. Glass was still alive, barely conscious, barely moving, but alive. Fear began to grow in the men left behind. They felt exposed. Vulnerable. Supplies were shrinking. The wilderness was closing in finally. They made a choice that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They took Glass's rifle. They took his knife. They took what little equipment he had left. And they walked away, leaving him alone on the open plains, certain the land would finish what the bear had started. At some point, Hugh Glass opened his eyes. The camp was silent. No voices, no horses, no fire, just wind moving through tall grass and pain pulsing through every part of his body. He tried to sit up and nearly blacked out. Every breath burned. Every movement felt impossible. He understood quickly what had happened. He had been abandoned. There would be no rescue. No one returning out of guilt. He had 2 choices now: lie still and let the cold and hunger take him, or move. He chose to move. He couldn't stand, so he rolled onto his side and began to drag himself forward. Inch by inch, using his elbows. Using whatever strength remained. He had no weapon. No real food. No protection. Only a direction in his mind: Fort Kiowa, more than 200 miles away. It was a distance no healthy man would willingly walk through that terrain. And he would attempt it broken. The first miles were slow and painful. Glass fed on wild berries, roots, and anything he could reach without straying far from his path. At night, he pressed himself into shallow depressions in the earth to shield against wind, and cold rain fell without mercy. The plains stretched endlessly around him. Days blurred together. Hunger gnawed at him constantly. Infection threatened his wounds. Yet something inside him refused to fade. It was more than survival. It was determination. The memory of being left behind burned hotter than the cold wind against his skin. The men who had walked away believed the wilderness had already claimed him. They were certain he would never rise again. But each mile he dragged himself forward proved them wrong. And somewhere ahead, beyond rivers and open plains and unknown danger, civilization waited. Whether he would reach it was uncertain. But he was no longer waiting to die. Days passed, though to Hugh Glass, they no longer felt like days. Time became something strange and shapeless. There was only light, and then darkness. Movement, and then exhaustion. The land did not care that he was wounded. The plains stretched endlessly, rolling and empty, offering no shelter from wind or rain. When he reached small streams, he lowered himself slowly, drinking like a man who had crossed a desert. More than once, he let the cold water carry his body downstream, floating carefully to save what little strength he had left. He moved mostly at night, hiding during the day when he feared being seen by hostile tribes. Every sound in the grass made his heart race. Every distant shape looked like danger. He was alone, completely alone, in a land that swallowed men without leaving a trace. At one point, he came across the remains of a buffalo killed by wolves. The meat was not fresh. It was not clean, but it was life. Glass forced himself to eat what he could, ignoring the taste, ignoring the smell. Survival had stripped everything down to one simple rule: keep moving. He fashioned crude bandages from whatever scraps he could find. He leaned on fallen branches to lift himself upright for short distances. Sometimes he collapsed after only a few steps. Sometimes he crawled for hours without realizing how far he had gone. His body was weakening, but his focus was sharpening. In his mind, he saw the faces of the men who had left him. He replayed that silent moment when he woke to find them gone. That memory became fuel. Weeks into the journey, Glass encountered a small group of Native Americans. Exhausted and barely recognizable as a threat, he expected the worst. Instead, they showed him unexpected mercy. They gave him food. They treated his wounds as best they could. They did not ask for repayment. In a land filled with danger, strangers offered him the first kindness he had felt since the attack. Strength slowly returned to his legs. Not much, but enough. For the first time since the bear attack, he began to walk more than crawl. Each step felt unreal. Each mile felt stolen from death itself. When he finally reached Fort Kiowa, the men there could hardly believe what they were seeing. A figure appeared in the distance, thin, scarred, barely standing, yet walking under his own power. It had been weeks, nearly 200 miles, through rivers, plains, and wilderness that had buried stronger men. Word spread quickly. Hugh Glass was alive. The man left for dead had returned. But survival was not the only thing driving him. There was still unfinished business. Glass learned that John Fitzgerald had enlisted in the army, placing himself beyond easy reach. The other man who had abandoned him was already dead. Revenge had fueled Glass through the wilderness, but standing there, alive against all odds, something shifted. He chose not to kill Fitzgerald. Some say it was because harming a soldier would mean execution. Others believe the journey had changed him. The wilderness had tested him. And he had endured. Perhaps that was enough. Hugh Glass did not become famous in his lifetime. There were no headlines, no grand celebrations, just a story passed quietly from trapper to trapper, about a man who refused to die. A man who crawled across 200 miles of unforgiving land because he would not surrender to pain, betrayal, or fear. In the end, it wasn't revenge that defined him. It was resilience. And sometimes, the most terrifying story is not about being hunted by something in the dark, it's about surviving when the world believes you're already gone.